Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
I woke up on my 19th birthday, expecting something special. Instead, I found my family decorating the living room with balloons and streamers for my 17-year-old brother Jake's perfect attendance celebration. While I watched from the kitchen doorway, Jake unwrapped a brand new iPhone and posed for pictures with his chocolate cake. When I mentioned it was my birthday, Mom handed me a half-eaten piece of leftover cake and a greeting card that read, "Be more like him," in bold letters. Everyone laughed like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. I forced a smile and pretended their words didn't slice through me like broken glass. The rest of that day felt like watching my own funeral from inside the coffin. I sat at the kitchen table, picking at my stale cake, while my family buzzed around Jake like he was some kind of celebrity. This wasn't new. For as long as I could remember, Jake had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I remained invisible. I thought about all the times my achievements had been ignored. When I made honor roll sophomore year, Dad was too busy at Jake's baseball game to notice. When I got promoted to shift supervisor at Henderson's grocery, Mom just nodded and asked if I could pick up Jake's prescription on my way home. When I fixed our neighbor's computer and earned $50, the family conversation lasted exactly 30 seconds before shifting to Jake's upcoming science fair project. Around 4 in the afternoon, relatives started arriving for what Mom kept calling Jake's special celebration. Aunt Linda pinched my cheek and asked what I was planning to do with my life now that I was getting older. Before I could answer, she was already gushing about Jake's academic performance. Uncle Tom clapped me on the shoulder and suggested I take some lessons from my younger brother about responsibility and focus. The worst moment came during dinner, when Dad stood up to make a toast. He raised his beer bottle and cleared his throat, looking directly at Jake with pride shining in his eyes. "To Jake, the son who gets it right," Dad announced, his voice carrying across the crowded dining room. "He shows up, works hard, and makes this family proud every single day. Jake understands what it means to be a real success." Mom nodded enthusiastically, adding her own commentary as everyone clinked their glasses. "Billy should really learn from Jake's example. Jake knows how to apply himself." I excused myself and went upstairs to my room, closing the door behind me. The muffled sounds of laughter and celebration continued below while I sat on my bed, staring at the few belongings that actually mattered to me. I pulled out my old backpack and started packing methodically. Clean clothes, toothbrush, the $45 I'd saved from my grocery store shifts, and my phone charger. That's when I heard Jake coming up the stairs, probably heading to the bathroom. He'd left his new iPhone on the hallway table, and something made me glance at the screen when a notification popped up. It was a group text message from a family chat I didn't even know existed. The preview showed enough to make my blood run cold. I picked up the phone and scrolled through recent messages. Mom had written 2 days ago, "The Billy problem isn't going away on its own. He's 19 and still acts like a child." Dad had responded, "Jake proves it's not our parenting. Some kids just don't have drive." Aunt Linda had chimed in, "Billy's always been disappointing compared to Jake. Maybe he'll grow out of it." The messages went on for weeks. Screenshots of Jake's grades with comments about how Billy could never measure up. Jokes about my job at the grocery store being appropriate for someone with limited ambition. Plans for today's celebration that specifically mentioned not making it about my birthday because Billy doesn't deserve to steal Jake's spotlight. I set the phone back down with shaking hands. This wasn't just favoritism or thoughtlessness. This was deliberate, calculated dismissal of my existence as anything more than a disappointment to be managed and compared unfavorably to their precious perfect son. I finished packing my backpack and waited until the house fell quiet around midnight. The relatives had gone home, and my parents had finally stopped cleaning up the party remnants. I could hear Dad snoring through their bedroom door as I crept downstairs and slipped out through the kitchen. The walk to the Greyhound station took 45 minutes through empty suburban streets lined with houses full of families that probably loved all their children equally. I bought a one-way ticket to Chicago with $28, leaving me with $17 to my name, and no plan beyond getting as far away as possible from the people who saw me as nothing more than a cautionary tale for their real son. The bus pulled away from Kansas at 2:30 in the morning, carrying me toward a city I'd never visited with no plan except escape. I pressed my forehead against the cool window and watched familiar landscapes disappear into darkness. For the first time in years, nobody knew where I was or what I was supposed to be doing, and that felt more like freedom than loneliness. Chicago appeared at dawn, like something from a movie. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky, and people moved with purpose along sidewalks, already busy, despite the early hour. I climbed off the bus at Union Station with my backpack and $17, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a city that didn't care about my problems or my past. The first challenge was finding somewhere to spend the day without spending money I couldn't afford to lose. I discovered a 24-hour diner called Mel's Kitchen about 6 blocks from the station, where a cup of coffee cost $2 and came with unlimited refills. The waitress was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes, who introduced herself as Carol. "You look like you've been traveling all night," she said, setting down my coffee cup and studying my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of lost young people. "Just got in from Kansas," I admitted, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug, looking for work. Carol nodded knowingly. "Chicago's got opportunities if you know where to look and aren't afraid of starting at the bottom. You got a place to stay?" I shook my head, and she disappeared into the kitchen. When she came back, she handed me a piece of paper with an address written in blue ink. "Hostel about 12 blocks north," she explained. "Tell them Carol sent you. They'll give you a bed for $15 a night, and the owner sometimes has odd jobs for folks who need quick cash." The hostel was exactly what I expected. Cramped, loud, and filled with other people who looked like they were running from something. But it was safe and clean, and the owner, a heavyset man named Pete, offered me $20 to help him move furniture from the basement to the 3rd floor. I spent the next 3 days walking the streets of Chicago, applying for any job that would hire someone without experience or references. Restaurant kitchens, delivery services, retail stores, construction crews. The responses were always the same. "We'll call you," or "We need someone with more experience," or "We're not hiring right now." My money dwindled to $8. I ate once a day, usually a sandwich from a convenience store, and spent my evenings at Mel's Kitchen nursing coffee and talking to Carol about the realities of city life. "Most folks who come here running from something don't last 2 weeks," she told me honestly on my 3rd night. "City chews them up and spits them back where they came from. But you seem different. Got some steel in you." On my 4th morning in Chicago, I was walking past a small electronics repair shop called Frank's Fix-It when I heard shouting from inside. Through the window, I saw an elderly man clutching his chest and leaning against a counter covered in smartphones and tablets. Without thinking, I pushed through the front door. "Sir, are you okay?" I called out, rushing to his side as he slumped toward the floor. The man was conscious, but struggling to breathe. He looked to be in his 70s, with white hair and weathered hands that shook as he tried to steady himself. I helped him sit down in a chair behind the counter and asked if he needed me to call an ambulance. "No ambulance," he wheezed, waving his hand dismissively. "Just need my heart medication. Bottle on the shelf behind you." I found the prescription bottle and helped him take a pill, then sat with him until his breathing returned to normal. As his color improved, he looked at me with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything about my appearance. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice stronger now. "Kansas," I replied. "Just got to town a few days ago." Running from something or running to something? The directness of his question caught me off guard. "Both, I think." He chuckled and extended his hand. "Frank Morrison. This is my shop. Has been for 32 years. Billy Patterson," I said, shaking his hand. "I was just walking by when I saw you were in trouble." Frank looked around his cluttered shop with an expression that mixed pride and worry. Electronic devices covered every surface, and handwritten repair tickets were stuck to a corkboard behind the cash register. Everything about the place felt like it belonged to an earlier decade. You know anything about fixing things? He asked. Some, I said cautiously. I've always been good with electronics. Taught myself mostly. Frank picked up a smartphone from the counter, an older model with a cracked screen that wouldn't turn on. He handed it to me, along with a small toolkit. Show me, he said simply. I examined the phone carefully, noticing that the battery connections were loose and the power button was stuck. Using Frank's tools, I carefully disassembled the device, reseated the battery connections, and freed the power button from accumulated debris. When I pressed the button, the phone came to life, displaying a lock screen with a photo of 2 young children. Frank stared at the working phone for several seconds before looking back at me. How long did that take you? I checked the time. About 8 minutes. That same repair has been sitting on my bench for 3 weeks, Frank said quietly. Customer gave up and bought a new phone. I was going to throw this one away. We talked for the next hour, while Frank showed me around his struggling business. He'd opened the shop in the early 90s, when electronic repairs were more common and profitable. Now, most people replaced broken devices instead of fixing them, and his customer base had shrunk to a handful of regulars and walk-ins who couldn't afford new equipment. Frank lived alone in a small apartment above the shop. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and his only son lived in California with grandchildren Frank saw once a year. The shop was his life's work, but he admitted that business had been declining steadily for years. I can barely pay rent some months, he confessed as we sat in his cramped office space behind the main counter. But this place is all I have left of the person I used to be. I understood that feeling better than he could have known. Before I could stop myself, I was telling Frank about my family, the birthday celebration that wasn't mine, and the text messages that had finally driven me away. Frank listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, and asking thoughtful questions about my skills and interests. When I finished talking, he made me an offer that changed everything. I can't pay you much, he said, but if you're willing to work hard and learn fast, I'll teach you everything I know about electronics repair. You can sleep upstairs in my spare room, and I'll split whatever profits we make 50-50. Deal? I looked around the cluttered shop that smelled like solder and old coffee, listening to the sounds of the city through windows that probably hadn't been cleaned in months. It wasn't much, but it was the first place since leaving home that felt like it might have room for me to grow into something more than a disappointment. Deal, I said, and meant it. My first week working for Frank opened my eyes to how much I didn't know about running a business. The shop was organized according to a system that made sense only to Frank. Customers paid in cash that he recorded in a handwritten ledger, and his idea of marketing was a yellowing business card taped to the front window. Despite the outdated methods, I could see the bones of something valuable. Frank possessed decades of technical knowledge that younger repair technicians didn't have. He could fix vintage electronics that other shops wouldn't touch, and his craftsmanship was meticulous. The problem wasn't his skills. It was that nobody knew he existed. Frank treated me like the apprentice he'd never had, patiently explaining the intricacies of circuit boards and component replacement. I absorbed everything he taught me while studying online tutorials late into the night, learning about digital marketing and social media strategies that could help small businesses reach new customers. After 2 weeks of observing the shop's operations, I approached Frank with an idea that I'd been developing during my evening research sessions. What if we created an online presence for the business? I suggested one morning as we opened the shop together. Social media accounts. Maybe some videos showing repair processes. People love watching craftsmen work. Frank looked skeptical. I don't know anything about that computer stuff, Billy. Seems like a waste of time when I could be fixing actual devices. Let me handle the online part, I offered. You focus on repairs, and I'll document the work and share it with people who might be interested. It won't cost anything except time. Frank shrugged and gave me permission to experiment, probably expecting nothing to come of it. I spent my lunch breaks creating social media accounts for Frank's Fix-It and filming short videos of Frank working on various repairs. His concentration and expertise made for compelling content, and I wrote captions explaining the technical challenges and solutions in language that regular people could understand. The response was immediate and surprising. Within days, Our videos were getting hundreds of views and dozens of comments from people impressed by Frank's skills. Local residents started bringing in devices they'd been planning to replace, and we received our first online repair requests from customers who found us through social media. Frank remained skeptical until a customer drove 40 minutes from the suburbs, specifically because she'd seen our video about vintage stereo repair. She brought in a 1970s turntable that 3 other shops had declared unfixable, and Frank had it working perfectly within 2 hours. "Maybe this internet thing isn't completely useless," he admitted that evening as we counted the day's receipts. For the first time since I'd known him, Frank seemed genuinely optimistic about the shop's future. Our social media following grew steadily as I learned to create content that highlighted Frank's expertise while making electronics repair accessible and interesting to general audiences. I started taking before and after photos of our work, writing detailed explanations of common problems, and responding to comments with helpful advice. The increased visibility brought in more customers, but it also revealed the depth of Frank's financial problems. While organizing his paperwork to prepare for tax season, I discovered notices from the bank that Frank had been hiding. The shop was 3 months behind on rent, and the building owner had initiated foreclosure proceedings. Frank found me reading through the documents in his office late one evening, and sat down heavily in his desk chair. "I didn't want you to worry about it," he said quietly. "Been trying to catch up on payments, but every month falls a little further behind." I looked at the numbers carefully. The shop owed $8,000 in back rent, and the bank had given Frank 30 days to pay in full or face eviction. Even with our recent improvements, we weren't making enough money to cover that debt. "How long have you been struggling like this?" I asked. Frank rubbed his temples with weathered fingers. "Since Margaret died, really, lost focus for a while, let things slide. By the time I realized how bad it had gotten, the hole was too deep to climb out of." I spent the next 3 days researching every possible solution. Small business loans required credit and collateral that Frank didn't have. Crowdfunding might raise some money, but probably not enough. The only realistic option was to dramatically increase our revenue within the next 4 weeks. That's when I realized our social media success had been too conservative. Instead of posting 1 video per day, we needed to create content that could go viral and bring in customers from across the entire Chicago metropolitan area. I presented Frank with a plan that would require both of us to work 16-hour days but might save the business. "We film comprehensive repair tutorials for the most common smartphone problems," I explained, showing him my research on popular search terms and video topics. "Not just quick fixes, but detailed walkthroughs that people can follow along with. Then we offer mail-in repair services for customers who prefer to have professionals do the work." Frank looked at the timeline I'd created, which showed us producing 20 detailed videos in 3 weeks, while maintaining regular repair services for walk-in customers. "You really think this could work?" he asked. "I think it's our only chance," I said honestly. Frank stared at the foreclosure notice for a long moment, then looked at me with the same expression he'd worn when I'd fixed that first smartphone. "Then we better get started," he said. The next 3 weeks blurred together in a marathon of filming, editing, and repairing that pushed both Frank and me beyond anything we'd attempted before. I learned to operate a camera while Frank explained complex procedures, and Frank discovered he had a natural teaching ability that made technical concepts clear and engaging. Our breakthrough came with a video about replacing iPhone screens, a common problem that most people either paid expensive fees to fix or used as an excuse to buy new phones. Frank's methodical approach and my clear explanation of each step created a tutorial that people could actually follow, and the response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed 25,000 times and shared across multiple social media platforms. Comments flooded in from people who'd successfully completed the repair and others asking for help with different devices. More importantly, our phone started ringing with customers requesting mail-in repairs and local residents wanting to bring devices to the shop. I created a system for managing the increased workload that played to both our strengths. Frank focused on complex repairs that required his expertise, while I handled social media, customer communication, and simpler fixes that I'd learned to complete reliably. We hired Pete from the hostel to help with packaging and shipping, turning his part-time odd jobs into steady employment. The business transformation was remarkable. Our daily revenue increased from $50 or $60 to over $300 within 2 weeks. Frank's confidence returned as he realized his skills were not only valuable, but increasingly rare in a world that had forgotten the art of repairing instead of replacing. Local news outlets began noticing our success story. Channel 7 sent a reporter to interview Frank about his business revival, and the resulting segment portrayed him as a craftsman preserving traditional skills in the digital age. The story was picked up by the Tribune's business section, which featured us in an article about innovative small businesses adapting to modern challenges. More importantly, we were making enough money to catch up on rent and establish a financial cushion for future growth. Frank opened a business savings account for the first time in years, and we started planning expansion possibilities that had seemed impossible just a month earlier. The personal impact was equally significant. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely good at something that mattered to people other than myself. Customers thanked me for saving them money and teaching them useful skills. Frank relied on my judgment and treated my contributions as essential rather than optional. I was editing our latest video late one Tuesday evening when my phone rang with a call from an unknown Chicago number. The voice on the other end belonged to a producer from a local television station who'd seen our viral content and wanted to feature us in a segment about young entrepreneurs. "We're interested in Billy Patterson's story," the producer explained. "A teenager who left home and built a successful business in less than 2 months. Our viewers love these kinds of success stories." The interview aired 3 days later during the evening news. They filmed me working alongside Frank, explaining how I'd transformed the business through digital marketing while learning electronics repair. The segment portrayed me as an example of young people creating their own opportunities instead of waiting for traditional paths to success. Frank watched the broadcast with pride that reminded me of how I'd always imagined a father should look at his son's achievements. "You've built something real here, Billy," he said as the segment ended. "Something that's yours." That night, I checked our social media accounts and discovered that our follower count had doubled overnight. Orders for mail-in repairs filled our inbox, and the phone rang constantly with local customers wanting appointments. But among the business inquiries was a message that made my stomach drop. My mother had found our business social media accounts and sent a private message. "Billy, we saw you on the news. We had no idea you were doing so well. Please call home. We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long time before closing the app without responding. My family had seen my success story on television, the same success they'd never believed I was capable of achieving. Now they wanted to talk, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what they had to say. The next morning brought more messages from family members who'd tracked down our business accounts. Jake had sent a friend request with a note. "I've been thinking about you every day since you left. Can we please talk?" Frank noticed my distraction as we worked through the morning's repair queue. When I explained about the family contacts, he set down his tools and looked at me with the serious expression that usually preceded his most valuable advice. "Success changes how people see you," he said carefully. "Sometimes that feels good, and sometimes it feels like too little too late. Either way, you get to decide what happens next on your own terms." I knew he was right, but I wasn't sure what my terms were, or whether I was strong enough to enforce them if my family tried to pull me back into old patterns. The Billy who'd left Kansas had been desperate and heartbroken. The Billy working in Frank's shop was confident and successful. The question was whether my family could see the difference, or if they'd just try to fit me back into the role of disappointing younger brother. I managed to ignore my family's messages for almost 2 weeks, while Frank and I focused on expanding the business. We hired 2 additional part-time employees, moved to a larger workspace in the back of the building, and started offering repair workshops, where customers could learn to fix their own devices under Frank's guidance. The workshops were my idea, but Frank's teaching ability made them successful. Watching middle-aged customers discover they could replace their own batteries or clean their own charging ports gave Frank a sense of purpose that went beyond simple business transactions. He was preserving knowledge that might otherwise disappear, and the students loved learning from someone who understood electronics at a fundamental level. Our revenue stabilized at over $2,000 per week, making Frank's Fix-It one of the most successful small businesses in the neighborhood. Frank started talking about franchising opportunities and maybe writing a book about electronics repair that combined his technical knowledge with stories from 3 decades of running an independent shop. But my family's attempts at contact became more persistent as our success gained wider attention. Local news stations in Kansas picked up the Chicago stories, and my mother's voicemails became increasingly desperate. "Billy, this is your mother," one message began. "We saw you on the news again. I know we made mistakes, but you're still our son. Please just call and let us know you're okay." The next message was longer and more emotional. "Your father and I have been talking about everything that happened. We realize we weren't fair to you. We were wrong, Billy. We're so sorry. Please come home." Frank encouraged me to at least listen to what they had to say, pointing out that holding on to anger takes energy that could be better used for building my future. Carol, the waitress from Mel's Kitchen who'd become my closest friend in Chicago, offered a different perspective when I stopped by for coffee one evening. "Some people change when they see you succeeding," she said, refilling my cup without being asked. "Question is whether they've changed because they realize they were wrong, or because they want something from your success." I was still avoiding the decision when Jake showed up at the shop on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I looked up from a tablet repair to see my 17-year-old brother standing in the doorway, looking nervous and younger than I remembered. "Hi, Billy," he said quietly. Frank, who was working at the counter nearby, immediately understood this was family drama and made himself busy in the back room. I set down my tools and faced Jake directly for the first time since leaving home. "How did you find me?" "Your business address is on all your social media accounts," Jake replied. "I took a Greyhound bus this morning. I have to be back tonight for school." Jake looked around the shop with obvious amazement. "This is really yours?" "Mine and Frank's," I corrected. "We're partners." Jake nodded and seemed to struggle with what to say next. Finally, he blurted out something I wasn't expecting. "Everything fell apart after you left." "What do you mean?" Jake sat down in the customer chair across from my workstation and rubbed his hands on his jeans like he used to do when he was nervous about confessing something to our parents. "Mom and Dad separated 6 weeks ago," he said. "They've been fighting constantly about what happened with you. Dad lost his construction contract, and Mom started drinking again. Nobody talks at dinner anymore." This wasn't what I'd expected to hear. I'd imagined my family continuing their perfect lives without the disappointment of my presence, not falling apart because I was gone. "The business is failing too," Jake continued. "Dad's been making mistakes on jobs, showing up late, arguing with clients. He lost 3 major contracts in 2 months. Jake looked down at his hands before continuing with the confession that hit me hardest. "I've been having panic attacks since school started. The pressure to be perfect all the time, knowing that everybody expects me to succeed where you supposedly failed. I can't sleep, and I throw up before tests." I stared at my younger brother, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our lives. The golden child who'd seemed effortlessly successful was actually struggling under the weight of expectations that our parents had placed on him to compensate for their perceived failure with me. "They never meant to hurt you," Jake said desperately. "They thought they were motivating you by comparing us. They didn't realize how much damage they were doing to both of us." "But they did hurt me," I said simply. "Every day for years." "I know," Jake said, and started crying. "I felt guilty every time they praised me for something you'd done first or better. I wanted to speak up, but I was scared they'd start treating me the way they treated you." Frank reappeared from the back room and approached us carefully. "Billy, why don't you take the afternoon off? I can handle things here." I looked at Jake, who was wiping his eyes with his sleeve and trying to compose himself. My little brother, who'd never been allowed to fail at anything, was finally learning what disappointment felt like, and it was destroying him. "Come on," I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. "Let me show you the city." We walked through downtown Chicago for 3 hours, while Jake told me everything that had happened since I'd left home. Our parents' marriage had been shakier than either of us realized, held together partly by their shared focus on managing their children's lives. Without me to worry about and criticize, they'd turn their attention to their own relationship problems. Dad's business troubles had started when he'd lost focus after I left. He'd made a major calculation error on a foundation job that cost him $12,000 and his reputation with the client who'd been referring other customers. Mom had started questioning all their parenting decisions and drinking wine every night while obsessing over our family's failures. They finally went to counseling last month, Jake explained as we sat on a bench near Lake Michigan. The therapist told them they'd been using you as a scapegoat for their own problems and setting both of us up to fail in different ways. What do you mean? They put all the pressure on me to be perfect, which made me anxious and afraid to take risks. But they never expected anything from you, which meant you never got credit when you did succeed. Jake was right, and hearing him articulate it so clearly made me realize how much my younger brother had been thinking about our family dynamics. He wasn't just the spoiled favorite I'd resented, he was another victim of our parents' dysfunctional approach to raising children. "Are you happy here?" Jake asked as we watched boats moving across the lake. I considered the question carefully. Yes, I think I am. For the first time in my life, I'm good at something that matters, and people respect what I contribute. Could you ever forgive them? That was the question I'd been avoiding for months. My anger had been fuel for my independence, motivation to prove myself in a place where nobody knew my history as the family disappointment. But holding on to that anger was starting to feel like carrying unnecessary weight. Maybe, I said finally. But things would have to be different. I'm not coming back to be the screw-up little brother who needs to learn from your example. Jake nodded seriously. I don't want to be the perfect son either. It's too exhausting. That evening, after Jake caught his bus back to Kansas, I called my mother for the first time since leaving home. The conversation was difficult and emotional, filled with apologies and explanations that didn't erase the years of hurt, but began the process of understanding how we'd all contributed to a family dynamic that hadn't worked for anyone. The phone conversation with my mother lasted almost 2 hours and covered years of accumulated resentments and misunderstandings. She cried while admitting that she'd treated me unfairly and explained how she'd projected her own fears about failure onto my teenage years. Your father and I were so young when we had you, she said through tears. We thought if we pushed you harder, compared you to Jake's successes, you'd find motivation to excel. We never realized we were destroying your confidence and teaching you to see yourself as inadequate. Her apologies felt genuine, but I could hear the desperation behind them. My family wasn't just sorry about hurting me, they were falling apart without the familiar dynamic of having me as their problem to fix. I need you to understand something, I told her, as our conversation neared its end. I'm not coming home to be the same person who left. I've built a life here, and I'm good at what I do. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be based on who I am now, not who you remember me being. Of course, she agreed quickly. We just want our son back. But I wasn't sure they understood that their son had never really existed in the form they remembered. The Billy they'd known had been shaped by their expectations and disappointments, and I was still discovering who I could become without those limitations. Over the following weeks, I maintained contact with my family through regular phone calls and video chats that Frank encouraged me to have in the shop's office space. He'd grown up with 6 siblings and understood family complications better than anyone else in my life. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or pretending the past didn't happen, he told me one evening as we closed up the shop. It's about deciding you're strong enough to control the relationship instead of letting old hurt control you. The family therapy sessions my parents had started included phone sessions where I participated from Chicago. The therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, helped all of us identify the patterns that had made our family interactions destructive and taught us communication skills that felt awkward but effective. During one session, Dad apologized for the toast he'd made at Jake's celebration, admitting that he'd been trying to motivate me through shame and comparison instead of recognizing my different strengths. Jake talked about the pressure he'd felt to be perfect and how guilty he'd always felt about receiving praise that came at my expense. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen asked each family member to identify what they'd lost when I left home. Mom talked about losing her eldest son, and realizing too late how much she'd taken my presence for granted. Jake talked about losing the brother who'd always helped him with homework and fixed things around the house. Dad's answer surprised everyone. I lost the son who inherited my problem-solving abilities. Billy was always the one who could figure out how to fix things or find creative solutions. I was too focused on his grades to notice that he had skills I'd been hoping to pass on. That session led to Dad's confession about his business troubles. Without my help around the house and shop, he'd struggled with tasks that I'd been handling informally for years. Equipment repairs, scheduling problems, customer communication issues that I'd quietly solved had become major problems after I left. "I never realized how much you contributed," he admitted during a private call a few days later. "You were always solving problems behind the scenes, and I thought that was normal instead of recognizing it as a valuable skill." 2 months after Jake's visit, Mom called with news that would test everything we'd discussed in therapy. Dad's construction business was facing bankruptcy, and they were about to lose the family home. The house they'd raised us in, where every room held memories of my childhood, would be sold to pay creditors unless they could find $18,000 within 6 weeks. "I know it's not fair to ask," Mom said carefully. "But your business is doing so well, and we didn't know if there might be any way you could help us figure something out." I told her I'd think about it, then spent the next week researching their financial situation and consulting with Frank about the business implications of a major loan to family members. Frank's advice was practical and compassionate. "You can afford to help them, but you need to do it in a way that protects your own future and establishes clear boundaries." The decision crystallized when Jake called me directly instead of going through our parents. "I don't want you to save the house because you feel guilty," he said, "but I want you to know that losing it would mean losing the last thing that feels like our family." I realized that my family's crisis was an opportunity to establish the new dynamic I wanted, instead of just reacting to their old patterns. If I helped them, it would be as a successful business owner making a strategic decision, not as the grateful son returning to solve their problems. I called a family meeting via video chat and presented my proposal. I would provide a business loan to help Dad restart his construction company, but the loan would come with conditions that protected my interests and required them to continue the changes they'd started in therapy. "The loan is $15,000 at 6% interest, paid back over 3 years, I explained, reading from the contract I'd drafted with help from Frank's lawyer. "Dad agrees to complete a business management course and implement the accounting systems I'll recommend. The family agrees to continue therapy for at least 6 more months. Most importantly, I added a condition that addressed the heart of our problems. If I come home to visit, it's as your son, who happens to be a successful business owner, not as someone who needs your approval or guidance to live his life." My parents agreed to every condition without hesitation, and we scheduled my first trip home for Thanksgiving weekend. I would see my family again, but this time as an equal partner in our relationship, rather than as the disappointment seeking redemption. Thanksgiving morning in Kansas felt surreal after 8 months of city living. The suburban streets looked smaller than I remembered, and the house where I'd grown up seemed like a museum of someone else's childhood. But the biggest change was in how my family looked at me when I walked through the front door. Instead of the dismissive glances and corrective comments that had defined my teenage years, I saw genuine respect and something that might have been awe. My parents had followed my business success through social media and local news coverage, and they treated me like a visiting dignitary rather than their chronically disappointing eldest son. "Billy," Mom said, hugging me at the door, with an emotion that felt different from the obligatory embraces of my youth. "I can't believe how much you've accomplished." The house showed signs of the financial stress my family had endured. Furniture looked worn, and several maintenance issues that I would have quietly fixed in the past remained unaddressed. But there was also evidence of positive changes. Dad had converted the basement into a proper office space where he could manage his construction business more professionally, and Jake's room no longer looked like a shrine to academic achievement. Dinner conversation focused on my work with Frank and the expansion plans we'd developed for the coming year. Dad asked detailed questions about business operations and marketing strategies, treating my expertise as valuable rather than dismissive of my age or experience. "You've built something remarkable," he said as Mom served pie that she'd made from scratch for the first time in years. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see your potential." Jake had grown 3 inches and gained confidence that showed in how he carried himself and spoke about his own interests. He'd started taking art classes and talked about applying to design schools instead of following the pre-med track our parents had always assumed he'd pursue. The therapy helped all of us figure out what we actually wanted instead of what we thought we were supposed to want, he explained as we walked around our old neighborhood that evening. The most significant change was in my parents' relationship with each other. They'd learned to communicate about problems instead of using their children as distractions from marital issues, and Dad had started helping around the house in ways that had never been expected when I was growing up. "We realized we'd been using you and Jake as excuses to avoid dealing with our own problems," Mom admitted during a conversation in the kitchen while we cleaned up after dinner. "It wasn't fair to either of you, and it wasn't healthy for our marriage." My visit home lasted 4 days, and each day reinforced my sense that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or pretending the past had been different. Instead, it meant choosing to build new relationships based on who we'd all become, rather than who we'd been during the most difficult years. Frank had given me a week off for the trip, but I found myself eager to return to Chicago and the life I'd built there. Kansas would always be where I'd grown up, but Chicago had become home in ways that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with finding people who valued my contributions. Dad's construction business benefited significantly from the organizational systems I'd learned while helping Frank modernize his shop. Within 3 months, Dad had recovered 2 of his lost contracts and gained 3 new clients who appreciated his improved communication and project management. The loan payments arrived promptly every month, and Dad often included notes updating me on business developments and asking for advice about marketing or customer relations. Our relationship had evolved into something resembling a partnership between 2 business owners who happened to be related. Jake visited me in Chicago twice during his senior year, spending a week each time learning about electronics repair and digital marketing. Frank enjoyed teaching him the same skills he'd taught me, and Jake discovered he had an artistic eye for creating compelling video content. "I want to study design and maybe help small businesses create better marketing materials," Jake told me during his second visit. "Watching what you did with Frank's business made me realize I want to help people succeed instead of just trying to be perfect myself. Most importantly, my family's crisis had taught all of us that love isn't measured by comparison or competition." Jake's achievements didn't diminish my value, and my success didn't threaten his worth. We could both excel in different areas and support each other instead of being forced into roles as competitors. A year after my 19th birthday disaster, we celebrated my 20th birthday with a small dinner at Frank's apartment above the shop. My parents drove up from Kansas, and Jake brought a girlfriend he'd been too nervous to introduce to the family before our relationship improved. Frank had become the grandfather figure none of us had expected to find, and Carol from Mel's Kitchen joined us with her husband and adult daughters. The celebration felt nothing like the family gatherings of my youth, because it included people who'd chosen to be there rather than attending out of obligation. "To Billy," Frank said, raising his glass of apple cider in a toast. "The young man who taught an old dog new tricks and saved a business that was ready to give up." Dad responded with his own toast. "To the son who taught his family that love means supporting each other's dreams instead of imposing our own." The evening ended with Jake and me working side by side in the shop, filming a tutorial video about smartphone maintenance that would be posted to our social media accounts the next morning. As we laughed about his mistakes with the camera angle and my attempts to explain technical concepts clearly, I realized that we'd finally become the brothers we'd both wanted to be. 6 months later, Frank and I opened our second location in Kansas City, managed by a partnership between Dad's construction company and our electronics repair business. The expansion represented everything I'd learned about building success through collaboration rather than competition, and it gave my family a chance to contribute to my achievements instead of feeling threatened by them. Success isn't about proving other people wrong or making them regret how they treated you. Real success is building a life that reflects your values and gives you opportunities to help the people you care about become their best versions of themselves. I learned that forgiveness doesn't require returning to old relationships that didn't work. Sometimes, love means creating entirely new ways of being family, based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than obligation and tradition. Most importantly, I discovered that running away can actually be the first step toward running to something better. Leaving my family forced all of us to examine the patterns that weren't working and choose to build something healthier. The boy who left Kansas on his 19th birthday, with $45 in a backpack, had been running from disappointment and rejection. The man who built a successful business and rebuilt his family relationships had learned to run toward opportunity and purpose. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt overlooked or undervalued by your family? Maybe you've had to leave a situation to discover your own worth. Share your story in the comments below, because I believe everyone has the potential to create positive change in their lives, even when the people closest to them can't see it yet. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and building success on your own terms. Don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is showing them who you really are instead of who they expect you to be. I hope you find the courage to pursue your own dreams, and I wish you all the success and happiness you deserve.